Yes, thank you very much. I was very interested in the discussion in the last one. My current major project, apart from the biography of Sir James Rowland, is actually a history of the medical legacies of the Vietnam War. And one of the issues that I've confronted is just the difference in the scale of the casualties that we had in the First World War as compared to Vietnam, and the long-term psychological and physical damage caused by those wars. The fact that we're talking about the medical legacies of the Vietnam War 50 years after the war is significant in itself. There was never such talk about the medical legacies of any other war, as far as I know. So it's a very interesting issue just in terms of how we react to casualties and long-term, particularly psychological damage caused by war, which does seem from Vietnam to be far more of an army issue than an Air Force issue, but nonetheless it would be true to some extent with the Air Force too. Just thinking back to Tom's comments about PhDs, I don't know what it says about my family dynamics that my mother never read my PhD, but then I never read hers either, so, and I've never read either of my sisters, so interesting family dynamics. The only person who read mine, apart from the examiners, died within a few weeks of having read it, so I never dared even suggest to anyone else that they read it. The title of my talk today is Sir James Rowland and the Changing Strategic Use of Air Power 1942 to 1979. Now, look, I can't make any claims to have any great knowledge or understanding of air power. The main source of my knowledge is probably the Biggles books, where the main strategic use of air power, of course, is to enable Biggles to save ginger and algae from Erich von Stalin and the other baddies they came across, and incidentally save the British Empire in the process. But the reason I've been asked to talk today is not because of my insights into air power, really, but because I've been working on editing and completing Sir James Rowland's autobiography. Before he died in 1998, Rowland wrote a very full account of his life up to 1947, but unfortunately only fragments of his story after that. So my task has been to edit his writing and then complete the story up to his death in 1998. The project's almost finished, and hopefully the book will be published before too long. Now, to try and cut the 130,000 words of the autobiography down to 2,499 to keep Tom happy. James Rowland was born in Armidale in New England in 1922 and grew up on his family's farm. His family was fairly comfortable financially, but it was still a fairly Spartan upbringing with no electricity and a very high level of self-sufficiency. When he was about 8 or 9, he saw his first aeroplane, so this would be about 1930. And he described it as a tiny biplane putting its way south. And he recalled that from this time I lost interest in ships and, fascinated by flight, started to make model aeroplanes. And I apologise for the quality of some of these old snaps, but that's him at the table making model aeroplanes, and that is a slightly distorted photo of him with one of his model aeroplanes. At the age of he looks about 12 or 13 in that photo. He sent the designs for that aeroplane off to a model aircraft magazine in New York, which published them, which published the designs. But at the same time, he sent a design for a rear-firing machine gun for a Hawker Fury. I don't know how many of you remember Hawker Fury as one of their last little biplanes before they thought the Hurricane was a better idea than building biplanes. And he, at the age of 14, he sent plans for a rear-firing machine gun. And Hawker wrote back a very serious letter saying that they thought it would upset the balance of the aircraft. So his ambition at this stage was to become an aircraft designer, and he wrote that he wanted to design aircraft, sleek and beautiful things with flowing lines that would be capable of great speeds, carrying far more passengers and cargo much greater distances than the aircraft of the 1930s. This was the leading edge of technology, and this was where I wanted to be. In 1935, Rowland went off to boarding school in Sydney on a scholarship. He did well at school, and in 1940 he enrolled in aeronautical engineering at Sydney University. But his mind was not completely on his studies. There's a page of his university notes. I don't know. You can read those. The heading at the top says technology and forging alloy, and he's got notes on 4% copper, 1% silicon and magnesium. And then at the bottom he's got this sketch of where he really thought he should be. He did some beautiful sketches of aeroplanes. All the time he was in England during the war, he just filled sketchbooks with pictures of aeroplanes, and I hope we can publish quite a few of those in the book when it comes out. By this time, of course, the Second World War was well underway, and Rowland was determined to join the Air Force and fly Spitfires. But his parents said he couldn't join up until he was 19. And by then, the manpower authorities had ruled that engineering students couldn't join up at all until they'd finished their courses. But Rowland chose to deliberately fail his second-year exam so he'd be thrown out of the course and so he could enlist. By late 1941, when Rowland joined the Air Force, the demand for fighter pilots was falling rapidly. What was wanted was aircrew for the bombing offensive against Germany. So the Empire Air Training Scheme sent him off to the elementary flying school at Temora, then to Canada, and in late 1943 to England. I actually spoke just a couple of weeks ago to an elderly gentleman who was in the same class at the Empire Air Training Scheme. He got as far as Canada, came top of the signalling class, and they kept him in Canada to teach signalling for the rest of the war. So instead of going off to fly Lancasters, he spent the rest of the war in Canada. But Jim Rowland was didn't have the same luck, if you could call it that. He was an outstanding pilot, and even before he'd flown on operations, he and his crew were selected for the Pathfinder Force. I don't know if that was common. I think it was actually very, very rare to be chosen for the Pathfinders before he'd flown any missions. This meant committing for a tour of 45 missions rather than the standard 30. But given that few crews survived the 30 operations tour, this appeared to make very little difference, and his crew seemed to quite happily put their hands up for 45 missions. That's a photo of him and his crew in front of their Lancaster. Rowland, a bit hard to see him in this photo, but is standing exactly in the middle. This would be the middle of 1944, so he was 22. He was the oldest in the crew. So Rowland became a small cog in the mighty machine of the bombing offensive against Germany. In the context of today's topic, it's worth saying a few words about the bombing campaign. In 1940, when Britain was fighting alone, an air offensive appeared to be the only way to attack Germany. So consequently, the British government decided to pour resources. Now, I saw the figure sometime about the percentage of GNP it put into its bombing campaign. And of course, when I came to do this paper, I couldn't find it. Not even Wikipedia seemed to have it. But my recollection, it was something like 20% of GNP or even more was put into building bombers and training bomber crews. Initially, the British bombing was focused on strictly military targets, but an analysis of bombing results in 1941, this analysis was done by a chap, David Ben Susan Butt, who was famous initially because he did the index for Keynes' General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money, the most important book on economics written since Adam Smith. And then after the war, he came to ANU to teach economics and was famously probably the most lazy person ever at ANU, and that's saying a great deal. Anyway, in 1941, he did this analysis of bombing results, and he showed that, in fact, British bombers hardly ever hit their targets. In fact, there were many occasions in which it appeared the Germans had no idea what target the British were even trying to hit. You know, they weren't within 10, 15, 20 miles of their targets. And the smallest target they could hit fairly reliably was a city. So the decision was made to attack cities. The strategic rationale for this was to dehouse the population and destroy German morale. The effectiveness of this campaign is still debated, but at the very least it led to an enormous diversion of German resources into air defences, although whether that outweighed the resources the British devoted to building bombers is unclear. But one consequence is clear, and in terms of our conversation about casualties, this is fairly significant. 55,000 members of Bomber Command were killed, including 3,486 Australians. So more Australians died in Bomber Command than have died in every war that we've fought since 1945. Rowland and his crew flew 34 missions between August 1944 and January 1945. He was awarded the DFC for completing a mission after an engine failure. However, on the 6th of January 1945, during a raid on Hanau near Frankfurt, his aircraft was rammed by another British bomber which was on its first operation. Rowland was the only survivor from the two aircraft, though recent research shows that several of his crew parachuted safely to ground only to be murdered by German police, a fairly common occurrence by 1944-45. Rowland was fortunate to survive capture by the Gestapo, but ended up in a POW camp until the end of the war. This is his POW ID card, he doesn't look a very happy captive, understandably, but where it says about his nose, his naser, it says it's thick and he had a broken nose. That occurred during his capture and interrogation. After the war, Rowland went back to university to finish his aeronautical engineering course, and then, having enjoyed his time in the Air Force so much, he decided in 1947 to rejoin. His flying skills and his engineering knowledge stamped him as a likely test pilot, so he was sent off to ARDU, the Aircraft Research and Development Unit, which was based at Laverton, in a move that was to have surprising ramifications for Rowland many years later. In September 1948, all the ARDU test pilots were transferred from the General Duties branch to the Engineering branch, and from this time all Rowland's training and promotions were in the Engineering branch. And there's a photo of the hero test pilot. In the 1950s, with supersonic flight coming in, so on, test pilots had really quite a public stature. You know, they often had their pictures in the newspapers and interviews. And that's Rowland, of course, in the cockpit with the ARDU crew around him. In 1949, he went to the Empire Test Pilot School in England, where he was the first Australian to fly a Canberra bomber and many other aircraft. The list of the aircraft that he flew in the 1940s and 50s is pages long. Most of them are well-known planes. Some of them I'd never heard of and had to look up to find out what they were. He then spent most of the 1950s with ARDU, which was working on the problems that the RAAF was having, introducing the F-86 Sabres and the Canberras into service. One of the problems that they had was that both aircraft tended to experience engine stalls at high altitudes in the unusually cold atmosphere over Darwin, which was a phenomenon that Rowland was among the first to observe. Rowland was also responsible for designing the fix to the unfortunate tendency of the Sabres to decapitate ejecting pilots, which is apparently a problem the Americans knew about, but they thought they had enough pilots and didn't bother fixing it. But Australia rather more careful with their pilots and thought it was a problem worth addressing. Rowland was involved from an early stage in the selection of a fighter to replace the Sabres, and he was one of the strongest opponents of buying the F-104 Starfighter, which was in retrospect a very wise decision. I actually spent much of 1972 travelling around Europe, and in Germany in particular. I think quite a few of the European air forces had starfighters. Did the Dutch? Yeah. You had to sort of keep a watch out overhead because there were so many starfighters crashing. It sort of felt like it was raining starfighters. In November 1960, the government decided to buy the Mirage, and Rowland was sent to Paris for 3 years as the senior engineer on the procurement team. That's the date of the announcement of the team going over to Paris. Rowland is the second from the left. The Mirage was the first aircraft that we didn't buy from either Britain or America. It was also chosen very early in its development, so the procurement team was faced with many new challenges. Rowland handled the complex technical issues with great skill, and he also had very fluent French, and that saved the project from several disasters. Following the successful introduction of the Mirages, the major engineering challenge for the RAAF the next decade was the introduction of the F-111, and Rowland was again heavily involved from the outset in dealing with the numerous teething problems of that brilliant aircraft. In November 1972 came what was expected to be his final promotion to be AMTS, the Air Member for Technical Services. There'd never been a Chief of the Air Staff who wasn't a General Duties pilot, In fact, the regulations insisted on it, and there was no reason to expect that it would be different when Charles Reid retired in March 1975. However, late in 1974, Lance Barnard, the Minister for Defence in the Whitlam government, nominated Jim Rowland to be the next chief. The reasons for the choice were never clearly stated, though it's fairly certain that the choice was made by Sir Arthur Tange as part of his crusade to reshape the Defence Department. Tange saw Rowland as having the flexibility of thought and the personal qualities to lead the Air Force through the inevitable turmoil that would follow the restructuring of the defence bureaucracy. Tange was also aware that the Air Force had what he described as some perplexing technical problems to address, particularly with the introduction of the F-111s. He believed an engineer would be best able to deal with those problems. I think I got those a bit out of order, but Sir Arthur Tange is the bottom left, and Jim Killen, who was Minister of Defence in the Fraser government. So for most of the time that Rowland was chief, Killen was the minister. It's Rowland, of course, standing at the back. But the appointment of Jim Rowland led to a revolt by the majority of general duties officers on the Air Board, who threatened to block Rowland's transfer from the engineer branch to the general duties branch. This led to perhaps the most extraordinary meeting in the history of the Air Board, where the Secretary of the Department of Air gave the board members a very stern lecture about their duty and political reality. Normally the minutes of the Air Board, and I'm probably the only person here who's read many years of the minutes of the Air Board, Martin perhaps accepted, but this one meeting is you can almost feel the steam coming off the paper. It's very exciting reading. And the upshot of that meeting was that the Air Board rolled over and Jim Rowland became chief. Now, the chief's job was never easy, but Jim Rowland, I think, faced greater challenges possibly than any previous peacetime chief. The mid-1970s saw simultaneously a major reorientation of Australia's strategic posture, a complete restructure of the Department of Defence involving radical changes in the way the RAAF was run, and at the same time Australia's most serious economic downturn since the 1930s, with rampant inflation and constant pressure on the defence budget. So defence budgets have been growing quite sharply during the 60s, and then all of a sudden just hit a brick wall in the early 70s and plummeted. Rowland had to lead the RAAF in developing new doctrines and policies for the new strategic environment. At the time, his budget was declining and every change had to be fought through the stifling committee system that was a feature of the new structure. Even though Rowland made no secret he'd rather have been flying than sitting in meetings, he never lost his enthusiasm for flying, and every chance he could he took to the air. But the perspective of time shows that he rose to the challenges that he faced with remarkable success. Within weeks of becoming CAS, the RAAF was called on to carry out evacuations from South Vietnam as the North Vietnamese army marched towards Saigon. The fall of South Vietnam marked the symbolic end of Australia's post-Second World War defence policy of forward defence based on acting with Britain or the United States to confront possible threats far from Australia. It's obviously a policy we've re-adopted, going even farther from Australia. But this policy in the 1950s and 60s had driven Australia's commitment to Korea, Malaya, Borneo and Vietnam. But the British withdrawal from east of Suez, followed by the disaster of Vietnam, led to a major shift in Australian policy. And the new policy of Fortress Australia emphasised the defence of mainland Australia from attack, with the focus being on commanding the air-sea gap between Australia and Southeast Asia. Inevitably, this led to priority being given to the Navy and the Air Force over the Army. It also led to a reorientation of Australia's armed forces from the south and east to the north and west. The new policy was combined with the assessment that Australia faced no foreseeable threat for the next 10 or 15 years. Accurate as it turned out, but a real concern for Rowland and the other service chiefs, not least because it justified the steep budget cuts they were experiencing. Now, Rowland became CAS having been immersed in the practical matters of aeronautical engineering rather than policy formation, but he quickly appreciated the new paradigm facing the RAAF and began the process of adapting both the theoretical and practical levels. He realised it was essential to develop new operational concepts for the new strategic environment, and he appointed David Evans as the Chief of Air Force Operations to develop an RAAF doctrine for the new era. So how long's that to go? Right, okay. Although the final version of Evans' ideas wasn't approved until after Rowland's retirement, many of the ideas had already been put into place. A good example of this was Rowland's early advocacy for the development of Tyndall as the RAAF's main northern base, where of course it would be less vulnerable both to enemy attack and cyclones than Darwin. But even more to the point was the concept of operations developed for the new F-111s. On the express orders of Charles Reid, the first F-111s to arrive in Australia were handled with extreme care, and pilots weren't allowed to explore the aircraft's potential. But Rowland lifted the restrictions on how the F-111s could be flown, and at the same time began to think through how and where they should be used. Originally, of course, they'd been bought because we felt threatened by Indonesia in the early 1960s under Sukarno. But once the Sukarno government fell, there was a complete transformation of relations with Indonesia, and by the 1970s it was clear that Indonesia had neither the intent nor the ability to threaten Australia. So what was the purpose of the F-111s and how were they to be used? And it was Rowland, working very closely with Neville McNamara and David Evans, who worked out the best way to integrate them into the Australian Air Force's doctrine. Almost without realising it, the RAAF, for the first time since the Second World War, found itself in possession of a formidable offensive weapon, and Rowland encouraged the operators to see what the aircraft was capable of, and not least because he rather enjoyed flying them himself, of course, and he didn't want to be very limited in what he could do in them, so he lifted the restrictions. By the time he stepped down as chief, the RAAF was operating the F-111s capably and confidently. It was obvious that they would give Australia a military edge in Southeast Asia for many years to come. Although Rowland came to the position of chief unexpectedly and without having occupied the usual preparatory postings, his outgoing personality, strong people skills and professional expertise that went well beyond his engineering training enabled him to guide the RAAF successfully through a turbulent period. Now, after retiring from the Air Force, he went on to be Governor of New South Wales for 8 years, and he was the only governor of the 20th century to be responsible for putting a government minister in jail. Many of you might remember the Rex Jackson affair. Anyone who drove down from Sydney to Wollongong in the 1990s could well have seen Rex, because after getting out of jail, he sold ice creams at from a little van at the Stanwell Park Lookout. So if you bought an ice cream there, you probably met Rex. I did, but it was before I knew that it was Rex. And when Rowland died in 1998, his eulogy was delivered not by an Air Force person, but by Neville Rand. Sorry, wrong way. And yes, there's Neville and Sir James together. You can sort of see why he was called Nifty, just from his eyes alone in that photo. Jim Rowland was an all-round good bloke. He was liked by everybody in the Air Force. He was an inspiring leader, a brilliant engineer and a sound strategic thinker. I think he would be humbled that this seminar day has been named in his honour, but at the same time he'd be deeply pleased that people are still thinking seriously about the strategic use of air power. Thank you.
Peter, we've corresponded on Sir James's attitude to this place, which was not very positive when it was being created. Was he a good joint operations man, or was really his first and foremost focus the Air Force, and did he feel the need, if you like, to keep the other two services away from where he wanted the Air Force to go?
Look, that's a good question. I've come across very little about it, which suggests that it's possible that he thought, very much just in Air Force terms. The only thing that he did to develop closer relations with the Army and the Navy was to institute a policy of having drinks with the chiefs of the Army and the Navy and their staff. But then he was fairly keen on having drinks with just about anybody.
So was Vice Admiral Sir David Stevenson. There we are. Your questions, please. In the front here. Thank you. And then, I think I saw one.
Hello, Jared Pendlebury from 35 Squadron. I listened to a program recently where a Vulcan bomber pilot reflected on his experience and involvement in flying nuclear deterrence missions in the Cold War, and he was basically sort of charting his the development of his view on the morality of the nuclear deterrent. I wonder if in Sir James's memoirs he ever reflected on his involvement in sort of area bombing, strategic bombing campaign in that part of the war.
Yeah. In about June 1945, after he'd been released from POW camp, was back in England, Rowland went back to visit his squadron, and because he loved flying so much, he borrowed a Lancaster, and with some of the ground crew who'd never been over Germany, he went on a daylight flight over many of the cities that they'd bombed, and this is reflecting back in 1997 when he's writing his memoirs, but he was just absolutely appalled at what they'd done. When he saw the impact, just saw whole cities just absolutely levelled, and he clearly would have had moral qualms about that, but his final thought was, what else could we have done? And he sort of accepted, Dresden, of course, is sort of the final, one where, did they finally cross the mark in bombing Dresden? The earlier ones, the justification's always been easier to make. And he was clearly wrestling with those moral issues, but I don't think he ever came to a firm conclusion about it. One interesting thing is that I've mentioned that some of his crew were murdered. He never knew that. He never knew what happened to his crew. It's only since he died that we've found out through the diligent research of someone whose uncle died in the crash, that the Germans had murdered his crew members.
Thanks, Dr. Wing Commander Steve Ferguson, Air Force Headquarters. You mentioned when Rowland took over as Chief of Air Staff, it was during a time of change both structurally in defence as well as national strategy. Arguably, we're going through a similar time at the moment. What lessons, if any, can we learn from his experience?
Keep your enemies close. I think that would be one that he would say that he had a lot of trouble dealing with the civilians in the defence bureaucracy, but the way he had of dealing with them was not to go in and shout and bluster, but to have drinks with them. And I think that that would be one lesson that he'd learned. Also, the other, going back to the first talk that we had, is very clear thinking about what you want and how to get there. I think that's the Air Force in the 50s and 60s had very much just a equipment replacement mentality that, the fighters are getting old, let's get new fighters. But in the mid-70s, for the first time, they started to think really carefully about, what sort of fighters, what do we need them for? And this was partly forced on them by Sir Arthur Tange, who demanded far greater intellectual clarity in what the forces were asking for. He wouldn't just tick off on, okay, you can get some new fighters. He made them justify everything. So I think clarity of thinking in that sense is very, very important, and possibly never more so than now when technological change is so rapid and the strategic environment so uncertain, and it is in 1975 when they could predict that we had 10 to 15 years of no foreseeable threat. You certainly wouldn't say that now.
Good day, I'm Wing Commander Darren Lovett, Chief of the Australian Space Operations Centre. When you talked about the board and its dilemmas about transferring an engineer across to GD, it did raise some interesting thoughts to me that it's often said that for an organisation like the Air Force, where it's very technologically based and hierarchical, that it becomes difficult to grow those senior leaders where you want to be more generalist and strategists across the board. So given you saw that dilemma in history, and Sir Arthur Tange was obviously part of that decision-making process, do you have any thoughts about that from an Air Force perspective, given that, say, perhaps on the Army side, they would talk more about generalists rising to the top rather than specialists?
Yeah, look, it's a really interesting question. I must say, as a total outsider, I found it very hard to comprehend the whole debate. Except in terms of protecting their patch, what were the general duties pilots carrying on about? Here's someone who, in operational terms, is far more experienced than probably any of them. He was a pilot, even if he was in the engineering branch. So I think that they would argue that he hadn't had the training in wider policy issues as an engineer, but the fact was he'd been to the Imperial Defence College for a year, he'd done Staff College. So yes, it was very hard to understand the full background to why they objected. But yes, I would have thought these days in particular, as technology becomes more and more important, that the need to have people who can understand that in high places is absolutely critical. I mean, so many big companies today you see getting in trouble because they've got CEOs who trained in accounting in the 1970s and 80s and don't have a clue about the technology. And that's what's bringing their companies undone.
And the other thing to remember is that Tange and Fraser, who was the Prime Minister, were actually good fishing buddies and spent weekends together at Yukonbee. And a lot of the postings and the star plot was worked out between Arthur and the Prime Minister, who dominated Killen. Killen had previously been Air Force, but Fraser dominated. Killen didn't want this place. Fraser said, "You're having it," and Killen fell into line. Tange was also... Is anyone here related to Sir Francis Hassett? I can speak freely then. He was the CDFS at the time, and I think that Arthur's view was that if that's the best thinking that could be produced, he was, of all the people that he worked with, Sir Francis Hassett, Chief of the Army, or Chief of General Staff and CDFS, he thought wasn't capable of that kind of creative engagement. So in Tange's time, in the same period, you had Arthur MacDonald, who was really difficult, Jim Rowland, who was not too bad as well, and then they tried to advance Tony Sinnott, who became Chief of the Naval Staff. And so I think Tange's trying to get people, not who agree with him, which is what I think people mistakenly think, but people who are genuine thinkers. And I would have thought the second half of the 70s, they're pretty impressive, both experience, expertise, and I think insight. That's how I see it anyway. And Arthur certainly wanted people to think and proposed that philosophy be a standard course here at the Academy to teach people to think. Perhaps one last question before we conclude. And across here, thank you.
Sorry, Chris McInnes again from Air Force. I guess following on from the question about his thinking on the morality of bombing, the story of the RAAF's identity in the Empire Air Training Scheme and involvement in Bomber Command, where the RAAF was basically dispersed and had no corporate identity. Did Sir Jim carry any of that, I guess, unpleasant identity experience forward with him? Or
Look,
not?
he chose to join an RAF squadron, not an RAAF squadron, and his crew was made up of people from all over. I think there was one other Australian, a couple of Canadians, a couple of New Zealanders, and some Brits. He thought that was wonderful. He had no trouble at all. He thought fighting as a Commonwealth unit was. And so many of the RAF squadrons had people from all over the Commonwealth. I think we sort of forget that, at that time, most Australians would call Britain home. And the development, which I think is very sad myself, of this separate Australian identity is separate from Britain is something very recent. And I think that we've got to remember that back in the 1940s, the vast majority of Australians thought very differently about that. And Jim Rowland had not the slightest problem. He chose to join an RAF squadron rather than an RAAF.
Thank you. Would you please join me in thanking you for this?
Thank you.